country has maximized its potential the most? Story 1. Just want to at least mention Botswana. It was the poorest country in the world at independence. It had no roads, no infrastructure of any kind, no industries to speak of, even its capital city was in another country. It had many disadvantages. It is landlocked. It was surrounded on three sides by racist apartheid states. It got hit very hard by the AIDS crisis before anybody could have known how to limit it. It had only 3 areas of any economic potential. Diamonds had just been discovered but were not being mined at scale yet. The local people raised cattle, and the region is very beautiful and can be valuable for tourism. Many African countries had far greater potential at their independence and failed to reach it for a whole bunch of reasons. But Botswana today is one of the most stable and prosperous countries in Africa, starting from the very back of the pack. It's amazing actually, no country in Africa has done so much with so little. Story 2 has to be the Asian tigers, specifically Singapore and Taiwan. They went from dirt-poor third-world backwaters to first-class city-states within a single generation, and the most incredible thing about their transformation is that unlike the oil-rich Arab countries, they did so with hardly any natural resources, just strong forward-thinking leadership, maximizing their location for geopolitical advantages, and an unrelenting investment in developing an educated and talented workforce. In Taiwan's case, they also used diplomatic leverage to keep an aggressive, infinitely more powerful rival China at bay. Story 3. The Netherlands. Very good infrastructure, world-leading companies like ASML and Philips, all while being at the constant risk of flooding and having few natural resources to speak of. Story 4. Ireland has no natural resources, out on the periphery of Europe, no significant domestic population economy, only independent for 100 years, done pretty well with the cards it's been dealt. Story 5. Despite the complicated history pre-1950, I have to feel that Japan is right up there. They really have a unique dedication to perfection across arts and disciplines that is unparalleled elsewhere. Anime, appliances, automobiles, cherry blossoms, gardens, seafood, other food, train travel, painting, pottery. Anything they dip their toes into, they go for full-on perfection in form and function in a way that no other culture quite matches. The runner-up in my book goes to Finland. Story 6. What about England? A tiny island with terrible weather becoming the largest, most powerful empire in history. I mean, they're kinda at a low point right now, but circa 1900 they had no rival in history up to that point. Story 7. Slovenia. Out of all countries in the Balkans, went from a forgotten middle child in Yugoslavia to a country which rivals Scandinavian countries in terms of quality of life. Very beautiful mountains. The hiking paths are very clean and it's very apparent they take great pride in their Alp tourism. Prices are comparable to Croatia, but their income is noticeably higher, so they don't complain much. Story 8. I think Denmark has done extremely well for a country with only 6 million people, Lego, Novo Nordisk, Bang & Olufsen, dairy and meat products, and among the happiest people globally. Story 9. My father worked in Singapore for 5 years. I have been there a couple of times. Virtually zero crime, totally safe for women, strong labor laws, excellent public transport system. The ruler of Singapore is the son of Singapore's founder Lee Kuan Yew Lky. He has done an excellent job and hence you don't see people uprising against him. Their motto is simple: do honest work and reap the benefits. I was studying in San Jose, USA, and my dad visited me from SG, and he said that SG is much better than the US, that itself should show how good SG is, but honestly I love it here in the US. Story 10. Hands down Israel. From arid desert to a high-tech nation, best water-saving and desalination technologies in the world, myriad of inventions and startups, high quality of life and great food, all through fighting for its survival continuously. Story 11. I think it's the US, colony to the world's superpower and biggest economy in under 300 years, surviving all the BS internal and external, highs and lows, and still remains. I get it, Cheeto Man sucks and he will be a weird footnote in the history books. We will continue to move forward and thrive. Story 12. Nordics, Switzerland, Monaco, Korea, Japan, AUSNZ Benelux, the new tiger economies, roughly in that order honorable mentions but not quite there. Ireland, Uruguay, Canada. Story 13. To be honest, and not even political, but both Taiwan and Singapore shouldn't really count in this discussion since they are way too small. In comparison, just look at Japan. A resource-poor island nation that got nuked twice and firebombed to oblivion after sending 1 million of their able-bodied men to die for their idealistic and zealous leaders' war of aggression. Afterwards it did a 180 and built the world's second-largest economy during the Cold War in less than 20 years. If that's not maximizing its potential, then I don't know what is. Story 14. I haven't seen anyone here make an argument for Qatar yet, so allow me. I think Qatar is the smallest country in the world that's managed to become a regional power. Only 3 million people live in Qatar, only 10 of whom are citizens notably, and it's only about the size of Massachusetts. Luckily, Qatar just happens to exist right next to the biggest natural gas field ever discovered on the planet, which is obviously the foundation of their ludicrous wealth, but Qatar also pioneered the LNG business, which enabled them to export their gas around the world and become a global energy great power. Qatar is one of the top 3 gas exporters in the world alongside the giants, Russia and the US. They've been able to use their ludicrous gas wealth to buy enormous influence for their tiny size. Al Jazeera is one of the largest journalism conglomerates in the world now. Qatar Airways is one of the most valuable airlines in the world, and they host the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East at Al Udeid, which makes them an indispensable U.S. ally to boot. They can also afford to bribe extremely powerful organizations and people, like with the FIFA World Cup they landed in 2022 and the recent 747 they gifted bribe to Trump. We can disagree with the ethics of Qatar all day, but they've certainly played their hand well and managed to transform a small, irrelevant, dusty, shitty backwater that was their peninsula for all of human history into a formidable power today. Story 15. Some people won't like this answer, but Israel turned a desert land by eradicating malaria and turned it into a thriving country, including the Silicon Valley of the Middle East, all while being surrounded by terrorists and enemies. Story 16. Japan. No other country has excelled in technology, fashion, and industry than Japan. I cannot include military since the United States has to defend them if they had to go to war. Most think it is because we bombed them. That's not true. They had already lost the war. USA bombed them to show Russia our power. Story 17. Israel. A third of Jews were annihilated 5 to 10 years before the country's foundation. The day of their independence, they were attacked by countless Arab neighbors and survived by a number of factors that are well documented. The country started with very little. They are subject to war every decade or two: 1948, Six-Day War, 1973 War, 1980 Lebanon War, 2006, etc. It's in the middle of the desert without any natural resources. The country is smaller than the state of Massachusetts. Its GDP is top 30 in the world despite its proximity to neighbors. It's globally recognized as a tech powerhouse and has one of the strongest militaries in the world. Israel has the highest number of startups per capita in the world. Story 18. Singapore. Every inch is built and planned on. You can't really get more efficient than Singapore. They also really took advantage of their geographical location. If we ignore microstates, then it's the Netherlands. How can a small little country be the third largest agricultural exporter in the world? Story 19. England or Great Britain. At the peak of the British Empire, around 1919, territories across the globe and a world war under our belt. No country with such a small landmass has any right being that powerful. Story 20. Monaco. Not even sure how it managed to stay as a separate country for all those centuries. Now is a playground for the mega-rich. Has some of the most expensive real estate in the world, yet is only a couple of square miles in size. Story 21. Singapore. 20 max tax, no corporation tax, low taxes for new business, guaranteed housing to citizens. Foreigners can't use public education or health. The wonderful Lee Kuan Yew. Story 22. Finland has hardly any natural resources, but somehow has managed to have the world's happiest people and the world's best education system. Maybe the two are related. Story 23. Germany constantly amazed me. Lost 2 world wars and now is the third biggest economy. Free education for everyone including international people. Free healthcare, Autobahn, its medical and pharma industry, tourism, current reliable leader of Western world, and the fact that it was split and unified in keeping EU in one piece is really magnificent. Story 24. Unpopular opinion here. Looks like China and India have done a good job of coming out of all that they were enduring, and before World War II, existence and prosperity of both the nations have been important for the stability of the world. However, of the two, India has been an underperformer and their recent turn towards fascism is very scary. Both China and India have been a byproduct of USSR. China has obviously figured out communist ideology better than USSR, while India simply moved away from it in a different direction. Story 25. Monaco seems to be pretty high up there in terms of resource exploitation though, probably Japan. They've got no natural resources and up until very recently all of their neighbors wanted them dead. Story 26. Nepal. Oh wait, despite being located between two of the largest populations and economies in the world, Nepal is still hopelessly underdeveloped and a backwater third world country. Story 27. Probably Singapore. Tiny in size but massive in impact, smart planning, strong economy, and super clean streets. They really did the most with what they had. Story 28. El Salvador has come a long way in terms of controlling the gangs. Whatever you think of the heavy-handed tactics used by the current president, they have produced results. Already known as a world-class surfing destination, if the security situation continues to improve, the numbers of sun-worshipping, bargain-hunting tourists will only increase. Story 29. Belgium. We are a mix of vastly different people, but despite very incompetent government and being overrun throughout history, we are not yet part of Germany, France, or the Netherlands. Story 30. Singapore. Hands down. As someone who lived there for 3 years, it's mind-blowing how they transformed from a tiny fishing village to a global financial powerhouse in just one generation. My grandma visited me there and couldn't believe a country with zero natural resources could build such an efficient society. Story 31. Switzerland is known for maximizing its potential through education, innovation, and political stability, becoming a global leader in finance and quality of life. Story 32. Norway, with their trillion-dollar trust fund from their North Sea oil and gas wealth, benefiting all citizens unlike British North Sea oil and Albertus oil, which only benefited big oil. Story 33. Easily Israel. Started as refugees dying of cholera in the swamps and without natural resources and small ancient communities in the cities. Now it's a high-tech nation with leading research institutions, desalination, Iron Dome, USB, instant messaging, Pilcam are a short list of pioneered inventions of this country. Has a GDP per capita matching that of Qatar and UAE but without any oil reserves, all while fighting a never-ending war with multiple neighbors. Story 34 ID say Singapore, because it's a small country because it is focused on education, good governance and infrastructure, and now it's one of the most developed countries. Story 35 I want to say Iceland. Any native people here can correct me, I am American, but in prior decades, it was a pretty isolated, economically depressed country. However, it is one of the most naturally beautiful and geographically interesting places in the world. I think they have done a fantastic job promoting tourism and giving visitors a wonderful and unique experience like no other. English is a widespread second language there. I did not meet a single person who did not speak English, from teens working in an ice cream shop to the 70-something bartender at one of the restaurants I visited. I think their infrastructure, number of hotel rooms, public transport options, etc. has a bit of catching up to do give their success in promoting tourism, but they are master marketers IMO, and I say this a career marketer. I visited several months ago and cannot wait to return. Story 36 people talk about Singapore being built out of nothing and not having natural resources or even farmland. Perhaps having limited potential is a blessing in disguise. Having potential and rich in resources made Vietnam a battleground for power both domestically and from colonial powers. Many aspects of South Vietnam's capital Saigon was similar to Singapore at the time. Just replace the British with the French. It was international with major ports, trading hubs, and by the 1960s had the highest English proficiency in Asia due to the American presence. Other than the American occupation post-World War II, Japan was not colonized. Attempts were made, if you can even say that, but the island nation was left alone, had the space to modernize its army before attempting to colonize other Asian countries. Vietnam never had this opportunity during that era. Japan is similarly sized, even shaped, to Vietnam and even population-wise. Most of Japan's land is mountainous, not as natural resource rich, and nowhere near as fertile as South Vietnam's Mekong Delta. From a Western colonizer's perspective, if they were to attempt to colonize one country, it would be better ROI return on investment to pick Vietnam over Japan. It's easier for a small country such as Singapore to have alignment and consensus. This becomes nearly impossible for countries with a large population spanning large geographical distances. People focus on the two major armies in Vietnam, but there were dozens of ideological factions with standing militias, including religious cults. We're talking millions of members and organized crime groups. The geographical distance meant that people can develop divergent ideologies over extended periods of time. The sharing of space and proximity in city-states forces people to get along and cooperate with their neighbors. With all this said, LKY is a genius and once in many centuries leader. However, I wonder if he would have had the top spot had he been in China or other large country. Large populations are prone to populism and electing the dumbest politicians that are mostly only good at lying to the masses. Now Vietnamese people go to Singapore to be migrant workers and maids. The rich ones go to Singapore for its medical services. Story 37 Poland might not have maximized their potential yet, but we are closed. When communism fell, there was a lot of unemployment and poverty, yet less than 30 years later we're pulling a lot of foreign investors and companies to here and returning successful. Story 38 I want to vouch for my home country so bad, but can't. Lithuania, considering it has been independent for only 35 years. Before that, the Soviets used it basically as a big factory and drained as much as they could. It is also a very small country, 2 times smaller than the state of New York alone with 17 of the population. So I think it is impressive what we have achieved almost everywhere you look. 3 players currently in the NBA with more prospects, more notable names in other sports, 4 restaurants with Michelin stars and a lot more with the lesser-known Michelin awards. Ever heard of Vint or NordVPN, Lithuanian startups? Lasers have been the most common point made when talking about Lithuanian industry. Other high technologies include pharmacy, fertilizer production, petrochemistry. However, it has not reached maximum potential because of a screwed government. It's more disappointing than anything. If there was proper funding, trust me, there exists the money needed. The EU helps a lot. We could reach so much more. Story 39 UK, invaded or fought 171 of 193 countries owned a quarter of the globe. A different country celebrates its independence from the UK roughly every 5 days. Launched the Industrial Revolution, invented the steam engine, TV, radio, computer, WWW, jet engine, baseball, etc. Story 40 Poland, after disappearing from maps for 123 years, then being battlefield of 2 biggest wars world has ever seen, having millions of our citizens slaughtered, through decades of communism, and then in 1 generation we are en route to surpass Japan in terms of GDP per capita. Of course there's so much more to be done and politicians have been mostly, but we've quickly gone from poorly developed agricultural nation to key player in eastern flank of Europe. Story 41 Israel is the objectively correct answer here. Sliver of land with 0 natural resource. A lot of it was malaria-ridden until the swamps were drained to get rid of the mosquitoes. Had war declared on it the day their independence was declared by 5 Arab nations, surrounded by enemy state that have declared war on it multiple times. Forced to spend almost 40% of their budget on defense for face extermination, now it has a GDP per capita higher than most Western European nations, equal rights for all citizens, and is the only democracy in the region. Story 42. I know a country that has minimized. India has the world's biggest youth population, but we up on education and civic sense, and we elected a fascist government before it was the trend. Story 43. The United States been the world's unchallenged superpower since Pearl Harbor forced it onto the global stage. The second, if when the US loses its hegemon status it should be rightfully dunked on, considering massive advantages like geography and natural resources, but the world's biggest economy and most powerful military make you one. Sounds like maximizing potential to me. Story 44. I would go against the flow and say Japan. At least it was the case until the 90s. After World War II, Japan was a devastated country. Not only did they lose the war but also got 2x nuclear bombs dropped on them. The people were poor, the economy was in utter shambles, but Japan picked itself up insanely quickly and turned into a global powerhouse. Well, the US played a huge role, but still, that being said, the country has been stagnant and even on the decline with magnitude of issues, for social to economical. They jumped so far ahead until the 90s, but had seemingly been stuck there ever since. That's why, IMO, there are so many mismatches around Japan. For example, their public transport system is still top-notch. Few can even rival them in terms of punctuality and efficiency. On the other hand, cash had remained the primary way of exchanging currency, though cashless payments have got much better in recent years. Or fax machines are still being widely used. Paperwork is a nightmare to go through. Story 45. Singapore has maximized its potential, but it is entirely opaque. I've lived in Singapore and studied there for some time. It was crazy for me as an Indian that you can't question anything at all. Not the government, not the politicians. The US is the best example. Managing to build such a hugely successful country, along with a functioning democracy which allows freedom of expression, is a huge achievement. There isn't any other country like it in the world. Story 46. UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, those Gulf countries, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha. Legit was nothing not too long ago. Now it's what it is today. Extremely rich, global financial and real estate hub, world tallest tower and multiple super innovative real estate development. No traditional income taxes. Why? All because they have a ton of oil and know how to maximize its profits to their benefit. Story 47. The US. Is this really a serious question? There isn't anywhere that the US can't destroy within hours, and everyone wants to illegally enter there. You can't be the world superpower and not have maximized their potential. Story 48. Singaporean here. The poor fishing village narrative undersells it slightly. A useful story told by the ruling party to boost their image. Singapore was a pretty major port through the 19th and early 20th centuries, connecting the Indian Ocean and South China Sea trading networks, and major export port for the Malay Peninsula. That said, the first generation of leaders played their hand brilliantly, doubling down on the key strategic location to build up the port. They also positioned Singapore as an air transport hub, back when air travel wasn't all that common, and they absolutely nailed the decisions to move up the industrial value chain. So, I take nothing away from those leaders, just wanted to debunk the poor fishing village a little. For what it's worth, I think Norway has played its hand pretty well too. They most certainly could not have gone the transport hub route that Singapore did. They received a different hand oil and are making good use of it. Story 49. I agree with this. There's some other countries that have done well to not squander resource wealth and other good fortune, but very few like Singapore that have created one of the wealthiest societies on earth out of almost nothing. It has no oil, no minerals, and barely any land, and it didn't even want to be an independent country when it was ejected from the newly formed Malaysia in 1965. All it had was good governance and hardworking people. Story 50. The fishing village narrative was driven by the ruling party. Singapore was a major British colonial port. Even before 1819 records are lost, it was a town with a port. Story 51. Well, it was founded by the English East India Company's Stamford Raffles far earlier, but yes, after the liberation from the Japanese after WW2 it likely was in a pitiful state. Story 52. Excuse my ignorance, but how did Singapore manage to avoid or resolve the post-colonial conflicts other ex-British colonies India, Pakistan, Cyprus, Turkey, etc. had? Story 53. The corrupt money from the Chinese diaspora from Indonesia and Malaysia, etc. is what explains the Singapore miracle to this day. If all the dirty money was pulled out of the big Singapore banks, then their system would be in shock. But in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even until the 90s it would have collapsed. Singapore. The cheap labor from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan is the other pillar. Singapore is only an example for Dubai and Qatar. Story 54. Singapore is literal definition of outdoor shopping mall. 30 minutes drive end to end. It is rich but no identity. Singaporeans literally live in outdoor shopping mall. Little India, Little China, etc. 5M population is more like city in disguise of a country. No defense system. Story 55. Same with South Korea. We used to be as poor as Afghanistan after World War II. Not a lot of land or natural resources, but lots of smart investments in heavy industry, education, and soft power along with our competitive work ethic led to democracy we see today. Story 56. Visited Taiwan last year for TP. Such an amazing country. Beautiful forests and landscapes. High quality products. Great infrastructure. Amazing people. Story 57. I always felt if the KMT had been in control of China and had won, China would have been a rival to the USA much earlier on. Taiwan is what China should have been. The culture, the vibrancy, the food, feels more like Japan in many ways. When you go from there to the mainland, the difference in mentality is palpable. Mainland is improving rapidly though. The Great Firewall is kinda porous and mainland Chinese are getting more and more mobile, so traveling a lot more. Story 58. It's crazy to think that Scotland and by extension the UK had comparable oil fields in the 70s onwards, but none if it was used to future-proof the country due to Thatcher's spending and privatization. The Macron report from 74 outlined what an independent Scotland would look like had it utilized its oil fields wisely, similar to Switzerland in terms of wealth. The report was classified as top secret for 30 years by Westminster to avoid Scottish independence rhetoric during the devolution vote of 1979, given that a yes vote might lead to full independence, robbed of a potential 450b 500 be adjusted for inflation from 1975 to 2020. Story 59. I would argue Norway could do better. We are not investing as much as we want into infrastructure that we could. You could argue about economical return of investment of completing railway from Oslo to Kirkenes, but I think as Norway is a country with such distances it should have a railway that combines the outer edges to each other. The money is there, but lack of visions from our politicians keeps it being a dream. Story 60 came here to say the same. Sure, some of the Asian countries also did an insane job, but almost no other country created generational wealth like Norway. Story 61. Norway's the ultimate play the game, win the prize move, drill like Texas, spend like Sweden. Meanwhile, other oil nations just hoard gold palaces and regret. Story 62. This is mainly because they saw what was happening in the Americas back in the 60s, all that oil money poured into the pockets of a few wealthy people. As a result, they created a state-owned oil company called Statoil, now known as Equinor and Gasco, which had the majority of the claims. All other companies has to pay something like 70 tax of their revenue. Gasco alone sells about 100 million euros worth of gas to the European continent every day, and that company is 100% state-owned. Story 63. And without an Iraqi petroleum engineer it might have looked very different. Farouk al-Qasim moved to Norway because his son was born with cerebral palsy, and Norway was one of the best countries for treatment. Story 64. I went to Zambia for 2 weeks last fall. Our group went to Botswana for a day safari, and it was very evident how much more put together Botswana was. I had a great time there. Story 65. This is the correct answer. It is so rare to see good governance in Africa. Botswana and now Rwanda are proving it can be done. Most African countries have been independent for decades and they still moan about colonial borders and exploitation. Do the work, fix the problems, stop stealing public funds. Story 66. I'd argue Botswana starting with so little is actually what allowed it to prosper. A good leader would never have gotten to power had the West realized they had any potential. Instead, a neo-colonial despot would have gotten a hold on power. Story 67. In the same vein of underrated African nations, I want to give a shout out to Rwanda. They have a monthly holiday on the last Saturday of the month where Rwandans get out on the streets and clean them up together. They call it Umuganda. Story 68. What about Mauritius? Tiny, resource-poor, cyclone-prone, and yet, since gaining independence in 1968, it has transformed from a monocrop sugar economy into a diversified one driven by tourism, textiles, financial services, and information technology. Through sound governance, strong institutions, and strategic investment in education and healthcare, Mauritius has achieved high human development, maintained democratic stability, and avoided the political turmoil that has affected many of its regional peers. Its multicultural society has been a source of strength, fostering social cohesion rather than division. While the country still faces challenges such as income inequality, youth unemployment, and climate vulnerability, Mauritius remains a standout example of how a nation with limited natural resources can leverage human capital, good policy, and global integration to achieve impressive and sustained development. Story 69. Yeah, it does amaze me about South Korea. It went from Japanese colonialism to being absolutely battered by the Korean War. One of the most common, general sayings here is South Korea used to be one of the poorest economies in the world, comparable to some of the poorest in Africa. I don't know how accurate that comparison really is, but life in South Korea for my parents when they were kids sounded absolutely dreadful. It's controversial to admit, but I personally agree with the assessment that the dictatorial powers, specifically Park Chung-hee aka the benevolent dictator, put the country back on track, despite sacrificing ethics and human rights. That being said, I'm of the mind that South Korea maximized its potential and that China's gradual takeover is inevitable. Every Samsung Electronics employees I've met, be it my brother or colleagues, admit that South Korea pushed its resources to their absolute limits and can now only lick their wounds as China gradually takes over the electronics business. According to my brother, China just has way too many resources and investments, that their gargantuan output is simply going to overrun Korea's regardless of how flawless South Korea strategizes. I've seen this trend happen recently with Chinese TVs being advertised more openly. My brother-in-law, who also worked at Samsung, as well as most colleagues, all talked of some kind of innovation crisis taking place as their departments were shrinking in size, and they've all collectively talked about how South Korea needed to invest in other sectors because TV and mobile phones were close to being finished. Story 70. It's weird that you'd mention China in a post about countries raising themselves out of poverty and yet won't give them credit for doing the same. China has lifted 770 million people out of abject poverty over 40 years. Story 71. Hate to be a Debbie Downer, but a lot of Singapore's success also relies on the importation of cheap labor from other countries, creating a caste system.